Despite being of Jewish extraction, his family of rabbinical lines on both his mother's and father's side, Karl Marx is framed as anti-Jewish, mainly by Zionist Jews, but also by some anti-Zionist secular leftist Jews. Many Jews believe Marx to be anti-Semitic because he believed humans should abandon their identity, religious, ethnic, etc., and replace it with a global, class-oriented identity defined by adherence to communist dogmatic principles. But Marx was particularly approving of an assimilationist position for Jews. He felt there was no room in a communist society for Jews as a separate ethnic or cultural group, because he thought the Jewish ethno-religion and culture was predicated on capitalist greed and material wealth. In his essay on the Jewish question, he wrote, quote, "What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money." Unquote. Marx believed that humanity could only be freed once they were emancipated from bourgeois Judeo-capitalism, and for this reason he denied the right of the Jews to autonomous existence. This, among other reasons, is why Marx is called anti-Jewish. He wanted to dispossess the Jews of their identity because he thought it would aid in destroying capitalism and liberating the proletariat. Jewish anti-Zionist and founder of eco-socialism, Joel Koval, who has framed support for Zionism as support for ethnic cleansing, wrote of Marx's anti-Jewishness, quote, "By anti-Semitism, I mean the denial of the right of the Jew to autonomous existence. This is an act of violence, addressed to an essential property of humanity, the assertion of an identity." Unquote. Both Zionist and anti-Zionist Jews see Marx's desire to strip Jews of their identity as an assault on the very existence of Jews as a group. It would seem these Jews realize that their identity is intrinsically linked to their existence and survival as an exclusive group of people. And this makes perfect sense because it is true. Identity is what unites humans with mutual similarities and affinities. It is what makes us what we are beyond just a member of the same species inhabiting the same planet. It gives us a collective sense of ourselves, but it is also what makes us who we are as individuals. It is what defines us. Humans have a primal desire to seek out, confirm, validate, and display our identity, our roots, our ethos, our sense of ourselves. This need is evidenced by all kinds of social behavior and tendencies we display as humans. It is seen more readily in groups that are more tribal and collectivized. The enemies of Europeans living in modern Western societies have bombarded us with ideologies and propaganda intended to purposefully atomize and break down our most basic of collective identities. Despite the Western intelligentsia class actively discouraging, vilifying, and suppressing traditional forms of European tribalism and identitarianism, our innate yearning to belong to a tribal identity and collective continue to seep through and can be seen in many modern phenomena. Think of the tribalism and identitarianism involved in national and regional sport fandom, the viral recent popularity of genetic ancestry tests, the increasing formation of tribal cults based on adherence to dogma, a void which was once filled by religion, as well as the phenomenon of cultural identity crises in Europeans who admire and want to belong to a foreign, more tribalized cultural identity, especially those that are glorified by the intelligentsia class. Because our sense of tribalism has been suppressed, we are more starved now than ever to understand who and what we are, and more importantly, where and what we came from. Our innate human need to belong to something larger than ourselves is perhaps the single most powerful socio-political force that exists. The tribal instinct in humans developed over hundreds of millennia as a way for humans with similar traits, affinities, goals, and ways of living to survive and prosper. Our need for tribal identity is ingrained in our evolutionary biology. It is a survival instinct, and therefore the only way to ignore tribal instinct, is to ignore survival instinct itself, and this is no easy feat. It takes concerted effort to ignore survival instinct. Many times it can only be accomplished through coercion and thought reform, a sort of cognitive dissonance and self-righteousness in one's own understanding of reality. Therefore, even though they fully recognize that tribal instinct is human nature, globalists continue to encourage Europeans to suppress this instinct, that it is primal and below us, a remnant of our barbaric past where our tribalism was essential to our survival. But therein lies the problem. Our tribe and identity is still essential to our survival. Everything I have just said is known by our enemies, by those who wish to displace, dispossess, disintegrate, and destroy us and the civilization we have built. So what better way to destroy our race, ethnicities, nations, and civilization, our tribe, than to redefine and therefore fundamentally destroy who we are? Our enemies cannot change who we are on a biological level, which is why they hate racial and ethnic nationalism so much. We do not deliberately ignore the genetic criteria required for ethnic identity. And so the next best strategy is to attempt to subvert our identity, to coerce us to change how we are defined as a collective group in order to disunite us, make us vulnerable to invasion, and groom us to accept the engineered destruction planned for us. When there is a lack of group identity, that identity is usually filled by nefarious groups. Then a nation that was once based on shared ancestry, an ethnic state like England, Sweden, Germany, or Ireland, can effectively be turned into a civic multi-ethnic state, where being English or Swedish or Irish or German, which are ethnic identities that include a genetic component, become little more than mere citizenship based on loosely shared and enforced cultural values, much like what the national identities of the colonies have become. The deracialization of the English ethnic group, for instance, has largely been accomplished through social coercion, and the mainstreaming of the notion that thinking there is a genetic component to being English is somehow evil. Only European groups are being coerced and encouraged to commit ethno-suicide for the sake of racial inclusion. And as Joe Colville said at the beginning of the video, Marx was an anti-Semite for denying the Jews the right to an autonomous existence, to an identity of their own. Redefining European ethnic identity is not just a wholesale act of anti-white violence, it is an act of ethnocide. It strips indigenous Europeans of their right to autonomous, exclusive existence, defined by shared ancestry. This anti-white engineered shift from ethnic to civic national identity in Europe not only represents a push to dispossess indigenous European peoples of their homelands, it represents a push to make the genetic component of being European no longer exist, thereby making Europeans no longer definable and no longer existent, at least in social terms. There are many powerful indicators that suggest our enemies know full well that racial and ethnic tribalism is the most powerful force to be reckoned with. One is that they actively attempt to reinterpret and multiracialize our history, thereby attempting to strip us of our exclusive right to it by blood. They do this because history is not inclusive. Our history is the story of our ancestors, not the ancestors of those who have invaded our nations in the last century. Our history has the power to instill a sense of tribalism and identitarianism in us. Proud, united people have a greater will to survive autonomously and resist enemy invasion. If you destroy the roots, you destroy the tree, and our enemies know this. Another is that the intelligentsia promotes a form of neo-Marxist hyper-identitarianism for non-whites living inside of our nations. Informed by the Marxist educator Paulo Freire's philosophy of critical consciousness, this hyper-tribalism serves to unite quote-unquote people of color under the banner of hatred, resentment, and opposition for whites, creating a classic Marxist dichotomous power framework between whites and non-whites. Meanwhile, the only models of racial and ethnic identity that the mainstream promotes for whites are those that promote collectivized demoralization, weakness, and ethnomasochism. Any form of racial and ethnic identity for whites that promotes collectivized pride, strength, and autonomy is painted as meaningless or evil, conflated with specters of the past, and deemed unacceptable according to the cultural and social norms which have been dictated by the same intelligentsia class that desire and will benefit from white disintegration and destruction. Tribalism and identitarianism are the greatest threats to their project. They know that this is the key to our survival, and that is why they try to discourage and demonize tribalism at every turn, as well as try to manipulate and redefine our identities to coerce us into accepting that genetics have no bearing in what defines us as groups.